Welcome to Chapter 4, Piano Styles, Ragtime to the Boogie Woogie. First thing I'd like to do is tell you how important it is to get a grip on what the left hand is doing in these piano styles. Ragtime is very different from Boogie Woogie, and they're both different from stride. And understanding that through the listening examples and Appendix B examples will give you the footing you need to discern between which style these pieces are in. You should begin your playlist for the final exam. So we begin that starting by adding these 3 tunes from Chapter 3. And after we get through today's or this week's work, we'll go back and add Chapter 4's listening examples. This is the required listening for Chapter 4. I've put links to all of this. There is a listening exam based on some of the listening guides in this music. If you have an extra hour this week, I would suggest that you follow these links and listen to the examples that's listed throughout the text as you go through Chapter 4. This is a lot of fun, really. And with no further ado, we're going to get into ragtime here. So some consider ragtime outside of jazz because it's composed, but even without being improvised like jazz is, it has the feel of improvisation. And some people think ragtime is actually the beginning of jazz. So there's opposing feelings about where ragtime lies, but considering it jazz is really appropriate. You're listening, again, I want to emphasize you're listening in this chapter. Born in the late 1800s, ragtime predated jazz. People like Buddy Bolton and Dixieland, it was before that. And it directly impacted the development of jazz. It actually had very unique beginnings. Dixieland bands didn't have a piano player, so folks often wanted to hire just one solo pianist rather than a whole band. And this is what prompted piano players to develop the ragtime style. The right hand played a highly syncopated, improvisational feel in the melody, and the left hand provided the bass on beats 1 and 3 and accented chords on 2 and 4. This creates a lot of jumping around in the left hand, a bass note and then a chord, bass note and a chord, bass note and a chord, and it's very difficult to do. It causes this ragged feeling in this left hand motion, and that's where the name ragtime most likely came from. Be sure to find that interactive listening guide in this section. And let's see, it originally existed, originally only existing music was played in this ragtime style, but after a while original tunes were composed. This style creates a really happy mood, which was a welcome thing after the Depression of the 1890s. It actually became popular because of world fairs. There were world fairs in Chicago, Omaha, Buffalo, St. Louis, and this style became very popular and it was in demand, and so created a demand for pianists who could play in this style to tour. A lot of them ended up migrating to Sedalia, Missouri. And in 1901, reform came to Missouri, and so the ragtime centers moved to St. Louis after that. Ragtime all over enjoyed about a 20-year run, and it had a lot of publishing success with Tin Pan Alley, but it was very difficult, and so that created demand for 2 things. One was teachers who could teach in the style, and the other was reduced arrangements that weren't quite as technically difficult. We need to actually look at the European influence on rags because the way they were structured or their form follows a march theme, really. It has 4 themes or 4 strains of equal importance, and eventually this shortened to 2, but it was structured on that march, and examples of that are Harlem Rag, Mississippi Rag, Tiger Rag, Maple Leaf Rag. So this rigid form got its structure from marches. Both black and white players had to be good readers in order to play ragtime. The most prolific ragtime composer was Scott Joplin. We are certain that he composed 50 rags, but there's rumors that he composed more than 600. But he also wrote symphonies and operas. One of those is still performed to this day. He has a monument erected in his honor at Maple Leaf Club in Sedalia, Missouri. And some of his music was repopularized when the 1973 movie The Sting came out and used ragtime music. You can't talk about ragtime without knowing the best time ragtime pianist, who was Jelly Roll Morton, a guy with a big ego. He claims credit for inventing everything. Jazz, ragtime, swing, you name it, he invented it. He did form his own piano and band, and others followed. One of his bands was Red Hot Peppers, another was the Stomp Kings, another was the Jazz Band, Jelly Roll Morton and the Jazz Band. He also played in a lot of other people's orchestras, King Oliver's, Benny Moulton's, Count Basie's, Jay McShaw, and a whole bunch more. He was a very fine pianist. He was also a fine band leader, an arranger, and a singer. Had an outgoing personality and a penchant for arranging exactly what others would play on the page. So his arranging abilities got him a lot of acclaim. He did some historically significant recordings in the 1930s with Alan Lomax. And his personality kind of established the performing personality that we see through performers throughout time. You want to listen to these two versions of Maple Leaf Rag, and you want to study this slide a little bit because there's some questions on the listening exam about these two. And with the listening guides, you can actually compare and see the difference of these two. After a while, ragtime and Dixieland merged. They started to add pianists to bands, and that brought in a bunch of changes. One was the basic melodic concept of rags changed. The accent on 2 and 4 that the ragtime pianist used with that bass chord, it carried over into Dixieland and made Dixieland sound more jazz-like. The 4 strains we talked about in the form reduced to 2, so it was more like a verse and chorus, like a hymn would be. And the meter changed from 4/4 to 2/4, so that mimicked that ragtime pianist's left-hand action. Here they suggest you listen to Paul Mayer's Maple Leaf Rag and New Orleans Rhythm King's Tiger Rag. These are jazz bands that are playing these rags. Ragtime lives on page 66, 68. So one of the key things about ragtime music is the way the piano sounds. And a lot of time it sounds very tinny, and that is gotten today by a couple of different techniques. One is placing thumbtacks in the felts of the hammers. Another is laying a chain across the strings, or newspaper or aluminum foil, anything that'll rattle across those strings to get that tinny sound. We're fortunate that there's a lot of piano roll recordings from old masters playing, and that gives us the opportunity to hear a lot of things. Some of the ones they suggest you listen to are Grandpa's Spells, Dead Man's Blues, Black Bottom Stomp. Okay, and one of the things that we need to talk about is Yubi Blake. I thought there was a slide on Yubi Blake. Was pretty sure there was a, well, going the wrong direction here. There's Yubi Blake. He lived to be 100 years old. When he was 86 years old, well, there was a compiled of his work called The 86 Years of Yubi Blake, and he was awarded the Medal of Freedom from Ronald Reagan in 1981. He was a charming composer and performer. He died at age 100. Ragtime waned after about 20 years, and stride piano became popular. And eventually, Dixieland destroyed the ragtime form, changing the 4 strains to 2. And so after about 1920, there wasn't a lot more ragtime. Okay. Let's see. Let me get where I'm at on the slides. However, there was a revival, and it happened a little bit before the Sting because pianists who were people who were studying to become pianists found out that studying things like Maple Leaf Rag made them better piano players. So there was this quiet revival that predated the movie, but in 1973 when the Sting came out, it used Scott Joplin's music, and ragtime was once again all the rage. Um, Technically, the Sting was set in 1936, a decade and a half after ragtime had kind of died out, but it set a great mood for that movie, and it worked somehow. And it gave us a lot of new material too. For example, The Entertainer is one of those that was composed for the Sting, and it became very popular. In 1981, there was a film called Ragtime that used rags, waltzes, and polkas, and it was a big hit. 1998, we had a Broadway musical named Ragtime that's done a lot of touring and taken Broadway by storm. It brought a modernized rag style to the forefront, using rag syncopations and melodic idioms. And one of your listening suggestions is Getting Ready Rag, which is from that Broadway musical, and I think you'll enjoy that. The bias against ragtime being considered jazz actually continued. So when the Redback Book of Rags won a Grammy, it didn't win it in the jazz category in 1973. It won in the chamber music, best chamber music category. So that bias still exists. Let's see. Moving on to Boogie Woogie. Boogie Woogie is a style that follows the blues progression harmonically, the 1 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord, 5 chord, 4 chord, and 1 chord. It came about during the Great Depression in the early 1930s, and this is another era where it was preferred to hire a solo pianist over a band. Listening is your friend here because that left hand characteristic of the boogie woogie is very definite, and you need to be able to hear that and listen to the 8 beats to the bar. It's created by an ostinato, which is just a fragment, a repeated pattern that's repeated over and over throughout the music. That's an ostinato. And it's a structural device that holds the piece together. For boogie woogie, it's always in the left hand, and it's very distinguished from the 4/4 Dixieland feel or the 2/4 ragtime feel. The feel is actually 8/8, even though it's written in 4/4. But that 8th note is the beat you feel because of that driving left hand. There are 2 styles. You can see that in Appendix B. One where the left hand plays chords, and one where the left hand plays a walking bass line. Because the right hand plays independently, it often sounds like 2 pianists instead of 1. The style is physically taxing, loud, tense. The right hand plays a lot of riffs, which are short melodic fragments. And unusually enough, untrained pianists are the ones who could pick up this style by ear, and oftentimes they could only play in this one style because they didn't read music. Pete Johnson was the #1 boogie woogie pianist in Kansas City, but he was very versatile. He could play stride and blues. It was a popular style of the 1930s, but existed earlier. And there are some other names that you might want to know here. In the 1920s, who was popular in the early 30s, in the late 30s and 40s. There's some names and some examples that you can Google to find more of that. Okay, Mead Lux Lewis is one of our listeners who plays in the boogie woogie style. Follow that listening guide. So they say that boogie woogie developed from logging camps, and where you'd have 3 guitars playing, and one would be laying down the melody, the other the rhythm, and a third guitar would be playing the bass line. And that's how boogie woogie developed, was trying to mimic that on the piano or convert it to the piano. Later big bands would pick up that style. Will Bradley, Lionel Hampton, Tommy Dorsey, Count Basie, Harry James, Glenn Miller, all kinds of them. Regardless, the style's range of expression is rather narrow. And then we want to move to stride piano, which is an extension of ragtime with three differences. It didn't follow the ragtime form. It incorporated a more improvised styles, and the pianist required great technique. You'll want to become familiar with James P. Johnson, Fats Waller, and Art Tatum.